Hello everybody, what's going on? This is Andrew, and today I wanted to take a look at the newly announced banned and restricted announcement, specifically with how it is going to impact the historic format. So the BNR came out this morning. There are a lot of things to go and look at. There were standard bans, which I think are great. There are legacy bans, which I know nothing about and will not comment on. And then there was this little snippet at the bottom of the announcement about historic. And it says that blue decks are still strong, so they're going to keep Memory Lapse banned forever. And I don't think anybody's going to be upset or question if that's the right decision or not. Most people will agree this card needs to stay gone. Additionally, as we have rebalanced Teferi Time Raveler into a form we believe is safe for historic, it will be removed from the ban list. Read more about it here. So you click on this link and you're scrolling down looking at all the rebalance cards waiting to get to Teferi. You come across this. Hullbreaker Horror no longer says can't be countered. Okay, so now they're making Hullbreaker Horror just a good card against creature decks. This is no longer the ridiculous control versus control finisher that it had been in the last couple weeks. That's really good. That's a good change. So then you scroll down a little bit more waiting to get to Teferi, and you see that they rebalanced Leer. Leer now only does stuff during your turn. Interesting. So now you can't use cards like Fading Hope or Divide by Zero or removal spells at instant speed. Interesting. So this is just those two cards are a pretty big knock to control decks and some of the play patterns that they've been using over the last few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see how control decks need to adapt moving forward. Let's keep that in mind and get down to Teferi. This is the card I really wanted to talk about and kind of the basis for a lot of what I'm thinking right now. So Teferi Time Raveler was a busted magic card, right? Let's look at the original copy of Teferi. Teferi is a 3-mana, 4 loyalty planeswalker. It says each opponent can only cast spells only time you could cast a sorcery. You can plus Teferi to let you cast sorceries at instant speed. And you can -3 Teferi to bounce something and draw a card. So Teferi has applications against creature decks because you could play him on 3 and bounce their 2-drop, draw a card, and now you've got a planeswalker on a board that has no creatures on it. Or Teferi was great in control mirrors because now your spells can't be countered basically. So Teferi had a lot going for it and was way too powerful, was banned in standard, historic, and pioneer. And so now we get this rebalanced Teferi. 4 mana instead of 3. So 5 loyalty instead of 4, which I think is fine. But the main thing that we want to look at here is its static text, which now says your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So not your opponents can only cast spells anytime they can play a sorcery. They can do stuff on their own turn at instant speed. But now they can't cast any spells during your turn. And I think that's good. I like this change a lot. I think that this is going to make Teferi a specialized anti-control card, as Wizards points out here. Because he's more expensive, he's going to be less effective at controlling the board. And he won't randomly stop cards like Finale of Promise and Dreadhorde Arcanist from working the way they're supposed to. But we still get Teferi back. We still get the bounce something, draw a card. We still get the plus to let you cast your spells at instant speed. And your opponent still can't interact with you on your turn. So, where does my mind go with historic decks that actually want Teferi? Well, if we take a quick look at the historic metagame, Is It Phoenix, Golgari Aggro, White-Green, Heliod Company are the most played decks. But then, if you look at Azorius Control versus Jeskai Control, these are similar decks, right? White-Blue versus Jeskai. They're both white-blue based control decks that make up close to 10% of the metagame. And if we come over and look at MTG Melee, they tend to agree with us. Jeskai Control, Azorius Lotus Field are some of the more popular decks. So those decks are going to take a hit. And so let's take a look at what like a white-blue control deck would look like. So this is just a regular white-blue control deck. We've got Narset Teferi, counter spells and removal, and Hullbreaker Horror in the sideboard. So I think that the biggest hit to these white-blue control decks is that they can no longer just rely on this one card backed up by counter magic to win control mirrors, which is going to be a hit. There's also the blue-white Lotus Field version of the deck, which would do the same thing. It's got a bunch of white-blue stuff in the main deck, a bunch of instants, and then Hullbreaker Horror. Okay, so these decks could play Teferi instead, and they probably will. And Teferi will be a decent anti-control card, but now you're gonna have to play around it. Like, since it's a 4-mana spell, it can get hit by your opponent's Archmage's Charms, or their Dovin Vetoes, or whatever. So, I actually think there's one deck that maybe you've noticed on some of the other pages, but I haven't talked about it yet. I think there's one deck that plays a more controlling gameplay that is going to be better at leveraging these changes than the traditional white-blue control deck. And I think it's the Niv Mizzet deck. So, the Niv Mizzet deck is a 5-color deck. It's base everything but green. Green's usually the splash. And it plays a bunch of triomes so that you can play untapped cards like Drowned Catacomb. So you can eventually cast Niv Mizzet, but on the way you just play a bunch of random stuff, right? You play Thoughtseizes, you play removal spells, you play some sweepers, and then eventually you play either a Niv Mizzet or a Teferi, Hero of Dominaria on 5. And you draw a bunch of cards, and then you take over the game from there. This deck, I think, will be able to leverage the new Teferi, the new old Teferi, a lot better than some of the other decks will. I'd been playing a copy of Oath of Kaya in my build of this deck, and I really liked it. I could see going up to a second Oath of Kaya, because Teferi it returns any artifact, creature, enchantment to its owner's hand, so you can bounce your own stuff. So bouncing Oath of Kaya to replay it, bouncing Hydroid Krasis to replay it. You can play a baby Krasis, like a Krasis for 2, get some advantage off of it, and then bounce it later on. You can bounce your Niv Mizzet to draw more cards if you really, really need to. The possibilities with just the cards to bounce in this deck are a lot better than in like a regular blue-white control deck. I will say that playing it with Key to the Archives does make a lot of sense. I think that there's something there probably, but I want to focus on its application in Niv Mizzet control. One of the other things that Teferi would do is it lets you cast your sorceries at instant speed. So this deck actually has a decent amount of sorceries that it wants to cast, notably Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Duress. This deck is basically an Esper base, kinda sorta, so we've got lots of blue-black lands and some white-black lands and stuff like that. So this deck wants to Thoughtseize and Duress its opponent a lot anyways. I think that this deck having access to Teferi is just going to make it that much stronger. It's going to turn... if you've never been draw step, Thoughtseized, or Duressed thanks to an opponent's Teferi, it's definitely something, and not something that you really want to have happen to you. But it also lets us cast like our expressive iterations at instant speed if we need to try to draw 2 cards once we have enough mana that we can cast another spell with it. It lets you cast sweepers at instant speed. Right, instant speeding a Culling Ritual or a Deafening Clarion is pretty good. Turns Maelstrom Pulse into an instant. I just think that the applications in this deck are really good, and Niv Mizzet lets you draw them, right? You can put Teferis in this deck, and then you can Niv Mizzet into your Teferi if you need to. Or you can just draw the big Teferi if you already, or if you don't need little Teferi anymore. I think that this deck is going to go up because the other control decks are going to go down, basically. And I'm excited for it. I'm here for it. I think that this deck is a lot of fun to play, and I'm definitely going to be looking forward to putting Teferi in a deck like this very soon. So just to recap, I think the Niv Mizzet decks are going to benefit the most from the controlling decks in Historic because they didn't really have a good way to deal with other control decks. They are so fine-tuned to beat aggro in game 1, and their only really way to deal with control decks post-board was to attack their hand more. I think Teferi is going to give them another access to attack control decks on, and I think it's going to be a really, really strong one. And I think that this combination of a really strong main deck to beat creature and mid-range decks with a strong sideboard plan to deal with the control matchups is going to push Niv Mizzet to the next level. So I'm going to try a couple Niv Mizzet builds later on, see if I'm right, more or less. So look for those videos. But that's going to be it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you next time.